Hey guys, okay, so we are going to finish chapter 4 right now. We're starting on page 75. That's where we left off. So basically, when we last read the chapter, George is off in town with most of the guys, and Lenny was kind of hanging around, and he ends up going into Crooks's room. Crooks, the stable buck guy, the guy that tends the horses. So Crooks at first is kind of like, get out of here, but then he invites Lenny in, and we talked about before, it's because Crooks really has no one, and he has no one even more than all the other guys because of his race. So he feels like he doesn't really trust white people because he feels like he's been completely just had people really be awful to him his entire life and never really felt accepted. And so he ends up inviting Lenny in, even though at first he doesn't really want him to, and now they end up talking a little bit. So this is Candy, the old guy with the one arm, or the one hand, sorry. Candy shows up, and he starts talking to Lenny about their plans with George to go away, to like go get a place of their own and live off the federal land with the rabbits and all that. So Crooks has just told Candy he could come in his room as well. So we're at the top of page 75 now. Candy seemed embarrassed. I don't know. Of course, if you want me to. Come on in. If everybody's coming in, you might just as well. It was difficult for Crooks to conceal his pleasure with anger. So again, we talked about like Crooks is excited right now because this is like the first time he's actually had people like come into his room, sit and talk with him and want to be with him and want to like care what he says. And this is like the first time he's really had companionship. Candy came in, but he was still embarrassed. You got a nice cozy little place in here, he said to Crooks. Must be nice to have a room all to yourself this way. Sure, said Crooks. And a manure pile under the window. Sure, it's swell. Lenny broke in. You said about them rabbits. Candy leaned against the wall beside the broken collar while he scratched the wrist stump. I've been here a long time, he said. And Crooks been here a long time. This is the first time I've ever been in his room. Crooks said darkly, guys don't come into a colored man's room very much. Nobody been here but Slim. Slim and the boss. Candy quickly changed the subject. Slim's as good a Skinner as I ever seen. Lenny leaned toward the old swamper. About them rabbits, he insisted. Candy smiled. I got it figured out. We can make some money on them rabbits if we go about it right. But I get to tend them, Lenny broke in. George says I get to tend them. He promised. Crooks interrupted brutally. You guys are just kidding yourself. You'll talk about it a hell of a lot, but you won't get no land. You'll be a swamper hill till they take you out in a box. Hell, I seen too many guys. Lenny here'll quit and be on the road in 2-3 weeks. Seems like every guy got land in his head. Candy rubbed his cheek angrily. You goddamn right we're gonna do it. George says we are. We got the money right now. Yeah, said Crooks. And where's George now? In town in a whorehouse. That's where your money's going. Jesus, I seen it happen too many times. I seen too many guys with land in their head. They never get none under their hand. Candy cried, Sure they all want it. Everybody wants a little bit of land. Not much. Just something that was his. Something he could live on and there wouldn't be nobody to throw him off of it. I never had none. I planted crops for damn near everybody in this state, but they wasn't my crops. And when I harvested them, it wasn't none of my harvest. But we're going to do it now. And don't make no mistake about that. George ain't got the money in town. That money's in the bank. Me and Lenny and George. We're going to have a room to ourselves. We're going to have a dog and rabbits and chickens. We're going to have green corn and maybe a cow or a goat. He stopped, overwhelmed with his picture. Crooks asked, You say you got the money? Damn right. We got most of it. Just a little bit more to get. Have it all in 1 month. George got the land all picked out, too. Crooks reached around and explored his spine with his hand. I never seen a guy really do it, he said. I seen guys nearly crazy with loneliness for land, but every time a whorehouse or a blackjack game took what it takes. He hesitated. If you guys would want a hand to work for nothing, just as keep, why, I'd come and lend a hand. I ain't so crippled I can't work, like a son of a bitch if I want to. Okay, so at first Crooks is like, yeah, that's never going to happen. You're never going to get this land. Everybody always says that they want land, and it never, ever happens. I've seen a ton of guys that have said they want this, and they never end up getting it. And Candy kind of convinces him, like, hey, this isn't just a pipe dream we're talking about. He says, like, we have money. It is in the bank. We have land picked out. We have, like, an actual plan to get this. And so now Crooks is kind of changing his tune and thinking, like, wow, like this is something that could actually happen. So he kind of saying like, hey, if you wouldn't mind, you don't have to pay me anything, but I'd like to come live there and work too, because everybody wants the same thing. When we first, when we were still in class, and before we started reading this, we talked about like the American dream, about how everybody has a different American dream of what they want. And these guys, all of them have the same thing in common, which is like kind of utter loneliness. And so Crooks feels cast off from everyone because he's black. Candy feels cast off from everyone because he's old and he has one hand. And Lenny and George really just have each other. So now that they all are kind of finding out that this could be a real thing, they all want to be a part of it so they can feel like they belong somewhere, like they have something and someone that cares about them. So Crooks kind of wants in on the whole we're going to get our own place thing too. Any of you boys seen Curly? They swung their heads toward the door. Looking in was Curly's wife. Her face was heavily made up. Her lips were slightly parted. She breathed strongly, as though she'd been running. Curly ain't been here, Candy said sourly. She stood still in the doorway, smiling a little at them, rubbing the nails of one hand with the thumb and forefinger of the other. And her eyes traveled from one face to another. They left all the weak ones here, she said, finally. Think I don't know where they all went? Even Curly, I know where they all went. Lenny watched her, fascinated. But Candy and Crooks were scowling down away from her eyes. Candy said, then if you know why you asked us where Curly's at. She regarded them amusedly. Funny thing, she said, if I catch any one man and he's alone, I get along with him fine. But just let two of the guys get together and you won't talk. Just nothing but mad. She dropped her fingers and put her hands on her hips. You're all scared of each other, that's what. Every one of you scared the rest is going to get something on you. After a pause, Crooks said, maybe you better go along to your own house now. We don't want no trouble. Well, I ain't giving you no trouble. Think I don't like to talk to somebody every once in a while? Think I like to stick in that house all the time? Candy laid the stump of his wrist on his knee and rubbed it gently with his hand. He said accusingly, you got a husband. You got no call fooling around with other guys, causing trouble. The girl flared up. Sure I got a husband. You all seen him. Swell guy, ain't he? Spends all his time saying what he's going to do to guys he don't like, and he don't like nobody. Think I'm going to stay in that 2x4 house and listen to how Curly's going to lead with his left twice and then bring in the old right cross? 1-2, he says. Just the old 1-2 and he'll go down. She paused, and her face lost its sullenness and grew interested. Say, what happened to Curly's hand? Okay, so even though it's kind of easy to dislike the character of Curly's wife, she has the same thing in common with all the other guys too, in that she's incredibly lonely. Like, they're saying like, yeah, you have a husband, go talk to your husband. And she's saying, yeah, look at the kind of guy I have for a husband. Look at what my life is. Like, I have to pretty much sit in this house by myself and just be with Curly, who's kind of a jerk all the time. And that's pretty much like all her life consists of. So even though she's probably going around it the wrong way, she's looking for companionship too, just like all the other ones. So she asks about Curly's hand, even though she definitely knows what happened. There was an embarrassed silence. Candy stole a look at Lenny. Then he coughed. Why, Curly, he got his hand caught in a machine, ma'am. Bust his hand. She watched for a moment and then she laughed. Baloney. What do you think you're selling me? Curly started something he didn't finish. Caught in a machine. Baloney. Why, he ain't give nobody the good old 1-2 since he got his hand bust. Who bust him? Candy repeated sullenly. Got caught in a machine. All right, she said contemptuously. All right, cover him up if you want to. What do I care? You bindle bums think you're so damn good. What do you think I am, a kid? I tell you, I could have went with shows. Not just one, neither. And a guy told me he could put me in pictures. She was breathless with indignation. Saturday night, everybody out doing something. Everybody. And what am I doing? Standing here talking to a bunch of bindle stiffs. A black man and a dum-dum and a lousy old sheep. And liking it because they ain't nobody else. Okay, so she kind of mentioned something here that she could have been in pictures, meaning like pictures like movies. So she's saying like, we'll kind of find out more about this a little bit later in the book. But she's saying there was like some guy once that told her that she was good enough to be put in pictures. And she feels like she kind of got the raw end of the deal because now she's married to someone like Curly, and she just is, like, that's all she has in her life now. Lenny watched her, his mouth half open. Crooks had retired into the terrible protective dignity of the Negro. But a change came over old Candy. He stood up suddenly and knocked his nail keg over backward. I had enough, he said angrily. You ain't wanted here. We told you you ain't. And I tell you, you got floozy ideas about what us guys amounts to. You ain't got sense enough in that chicken head to even see that we ain't stiff. Suppose you get us canned. Suppose you do. You think we'll hit the highway and look for another lousy two-bit job like this? You don't know that we got our ranch to go to and our own house. We ain't got to stay here. We got a house and chickens and fruit trees and a place 100 times prettier than this. And we got friends. That's what we got. Maybe there was a time when we were scared of getting canned, but we ain't no more. We got our own land and it's ours and we can go to it. Curly's wife laughed at him. Baloney, she said. I've seen too many of you guys. If you had 2 bits in the world, why, you'd be getting in 2 shots of corn with it and sucking the bottom of the glass. I know you guys. Basically, she's saying, like, yeah, I don't believe you. If you had money, you'd be spending it all on whiskey, like alcohol. Candy's face had grown redder and redder, but before she was done speaking, he had control of himself. He was the master of the situation. I might have knew, he said gently. Maybe you just better go along and roll your hoop. We ain't got nothing to say to you at all. We know what we got, and we don't care whether you know it or not. So maybe you just better scatter along now, because Curly maybe ain't going to like his wife out here in the barn with us bindle stiffs. She looked from one face to another, and they were all closed against her. And she looked longest at Lenny, until he dropped his eyes in embarrassment. Suddenly she said, Where'd you get them bruises on your face? Lenny looked up guiltily. Who, me? Yeah, you. Lenny looked to Candy for help, and then he looked at his lap again. He got his hand caught in a machine, he said. So Curly's wife the whole time, knew that someone had beaten Curly up. She just didn't know who, and Lenny basically gave it away. Curly's wife laughed. Okay, machine. I'll talk to you later. I like machines. Candy broke in. You let this guy alone. Don't you do no messing around with him. I'm going to tell George what you says. George would have you messing around with Lenny. Who's George? She asked. The little guy you come with? Lenny smiled happily. That's him, he said. That's the guy, and he's going to let me tend the rabbits. Well, if that's all you want, I might get a couple of rabbits myself. Crooks stood up from his bunk and faced her. I had enough, he said coldly. You got no rights coming in a colored man's room. You got no rights messing around here at all. Now you just get out and get out quick. If you don't, I'm going to ask the boss not to ever let you come in the barn no more. She turned on him in scorn. Listen, she said. You know what I can do if you open your trap? Crooks stared hopelessly at her, and then he sat down on his bunk and drew into himself. She closed on him. You know what I could do? Crooks seemed to grow smaller, and he pressed himself against the wall. Yes, ma'am. Well, you keep your place then. I could get you strung up on a tree so easy and it ain't even funny. Crooks had reduced himself to nothing. There was no personality, no ego, nothing to arouse either like or dislike. He said, yes, ma'am, and his voice was toneless. So at first, Crooks kind of gets this feeling like, get out of my room. What are you staying in here for? I didn't ask you to come in here. And so he kind of feels confident. And she, pretty much in one sentence, completely destroys that confidence that he has, basically saying, you know that I'm better than you because I'm white and you're not. And if I said one thing, I could get you, basically lynched from here. I could get you killed. I could get you fired. And he knows that what she says is true. For a moment, she stood over him as though waiting for him to move so that she could whip at him again. But Crooks sat perfectly still, his eyes averted, everything that might be hurt drawn in. She turned at last to the other two. Old Candy was watching her, fascinated. If you was to do that, we'd tell, he said quietly. We'd tell about you framing Crooks. Tell and be damned, she cried. Nobody listened to you, and you know it. Nobody listened to you. Candy subsided. No, he agreed. Nobody listened to us. Lenny whined. I wish George was here. I wish George was here. Candy stepped over to him. Don't you worry none, he said. I just heard the guys coming in. George will be in the bunkhouse right now, I bet. He turned to Curly's wife. You better go home now, he said quietly. If you go right now, we won't tell Curly you was here. She appraised him coolly. I ain't sure you heard nothing. Better not take no chances, he said. If you ain't sure, you better take the safe way. She turned to Lenny. I'm glad you bust up Curly a little bit. He got it coming to him. Sometimes I'd like to bust him myself. She slipped out the door and disappeared into the dark barn. And while she went through the barn, the halter chains rattled, and some horses snorted and stamped their feet. Crooks seemed to come slowly out of the layers of protection he had put on. Was that the truth, what you said about the guys come back? He asked. Sure, I heard him. Well, I didn't hear nothing. The gate banged, Candy said and went on. Jesus Christ, Curly's wife can move quiet. I guess she had a lot of practice, though. Crooks avoided the whole subject now. Maybe you guys better go, he said. I ain't sure I want you in here no more. A colored man gotta have some rights, even if you don't like him. Candy said, that bitch did not have said that to you. It wasn't nothing, Crooks said dully. You guys coming in and said made me forget. What she says is true. The horses snorted out in the barn, and the chains rang, and a voice called, Lenny! Oh, Lenny, you in the barn? It's George, Lenny cried, and he answered, Here, George, I'm right in here. In a second, George stood framed in the door, and he looked disapprovingly about. What are you doing in Crooks's room? You hadn't ought to be in here. Crooks nodded. I told them, but they come in anyways. Well, why didn't you kick him out? I didn't care much, said Crooks. Lenny's a nice fella. Now Candy aroused himself. Oh, George, I've been figuring. I got it doped out how we can even make some money on them rabbits. George scowled. I thought I told you not to tell nobody about that. Candy was crestfallen. Didn't tell nobody but Crooks. George said, Well, you guys got to get out of here. Jesus, seems like I can't go away for a minute. Candy and Lenny stood up and went toward the door. Crooks called, Candy! Huh? Remember what I said about hoeing and doing odd jobs? Yeah, said Candy. I remember. Well, just forget it, said Crooks. I didn't mean it. Just fooling. I wouldn't want to go to no place like that. Well, okay, if you feel like that. Good night. The three men went out the door. As they went through the barn, the horses snorted and the halter chains rattled. Crooks sat on his bunk and looked at the door for a moment, and then he reached for the liniment bottle. He pulled out his shirt and back, poured a little liniment in his pink palm, and reaching around, he fell slowly to rubbing his back. Okay, so at the end of the chapter, they're all leaving, and Crooks calls to Candy again and says, hey, remember how I said I wanted to come to your place and I'd want to work there with you and live there? Well, forget it. I don't want that. I was joking. Okay, so he really wasn't actually joking about it when he first said it, but he changes his mind about going there now for two reasons. The first one is because of what Curly's wife made him feel. He kind of felt like he was finally like maybe had a place and belonged and had someone to talk to, and she reminded him about like the racism that exists during this time. So he feels like kind of isolated and cut off again. But also the second reason is on this very last page. George hears Candy talking about their ranch, and he says, hey, I thought I told you not to tell anybody. Like, we're keeping it a secret. And Candy says, oh, I didn't tell anybody but Crooks. Almost like, who cares about Crooks? He doesn't mean anything. I didn't tell anybody important that actually matters. And even though Candy didn't mean to hurt Crooks and kind of like wound his pride and hurt his feelings, he did. And so even though Crooks has been feeling this whole time like maybe he was something to someone and could be important, at the very end he feels they've like basically reconfirmed what he felt the whole time. Like he's pretty much nothing. Okay, so that's all I want you guys to do for today's e-learning is just to listen to that and read along for it. On Friday, we are going to have chapters 3 and 4 quiz over the book. So if you have questions at all, if you want to look through chapters 3 and 4, if you have questions before Friday, just ask me or email me and I'll respond to you as soon as I get them. And we will take the quiz then. It'll be just how the first one was laid out of chapters 1 and 2. So it'll just be like short answer questions. All right, see you later.